Good afternoon, everyone. It's exactly 4:05 now. Welcome. Welcome to this RSS Quality Improvement Section meeting. My name is Shirley Coleman, and it's my privilege to chair the Quality Improvement Section. Our meeting today is entitled Dr Groundlove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Central Limit Theorem. We have three speakers. Firstly, Peter Witherington, who is a director of RSK, an engineering and environmental consultancy based in the UK with over 5,000 staff. Secondly, Nigel Marriott, an independent statistician with an extensive consultancy and training portfolio. And thirdly, Ron Wasserstein, the executive director of the American Statistical Association, the ASA. We will have time for questions between their three talks, and we will have at least 20 minutes at the end for more general discussion. And we'll close the meeting at 6 o'clock UK time. First, a few housekeeping notes, although these are in the chat, but I'll just mention them quickly. The meeting is being recorded, and you're welcome to request that any contribution you make is deleted from the recording, if that's what you wish, by contacting our RSS facilitator, Luth Martinez. The recording will appear on the RSS YouTube channel in a week or so. During the talks, please turn off your cameras and, very importantly, mute your microphones. Please use the chat facility to pose questions or make comments. In the discussion periods, please use the raise hand facility, if you can locate that at the top of the screen, when you want to speak, and we will invite you to unmute. So, looking at our introductory slide there, the right-hand side shows Dr. Strangelove and may resonate with film lovers, reminding them of this highly influential film from the 1960s, directed by Stanley Kubrick. The speakers have borrowed the wording for today's meeting, you'll see. The left-hand side shows the relevance of our topic today. Developers are planning to bulldoze one of the car parks at the American Statistical Association, and are happily digging up the land in the foreground. But to continue with the job, they first have to deal with ground contamination from the petrol station, which you can see in blue in the background of the picture. This is no doubt a scenario that is very familiar to our speakers. I'd now like to introduce Peter Witherington. If you'd like to put your first slide up, Peter, and I'll just introduce you. Peter is a director of the RSK Group, a UK-based international environmental services, engineering and contracting company. RSK seems to stand for responsible, sustainable and knowledgeable, according to the website. He is a chartered civil engineer with 40 years' experience in dealing with geotechnical and environmental land-related issues. He's been involved in various capacities within different government departments and latterly in the development of contaminated land regulations in the UK and the associated statutory guidance. He's been both author and steering group member on many contaminated land-related research projects, but in particular with CLARE, which is an acronym for Contaminated Land, Applications in Real Environments, and the 2008 project, which was to give guidance on comparing soil contamination data with a critical concentration. He was then instrumental in setting up a review of this work, and that was undertaken by Nigel Marriott. The update was published in 2020, and it's this new guidance that is the motivation for today's event. So Peter will explain how and why the industry needs to use statistics, the issues with the previous statistics guidance, and why Claire decided new guidance was needed. So over to you, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. Well, I've sort of entitled my talk, Why Do I Need Statistics? And it's a view from the contaminated land industry. And I've decided that as an engineer, the last thing I want to do is give you any numbers. So I'm only just going to give you really a load of pictures and maybe highlight some of the issues we as an industry face and why we need to be able to basically interpret data in a reliable way to give people confidence in solutions that we come up with. So without any further ado, I just talk a little bit about the pressures on brownfield development in the United Kingdom. I'm going to talk pretty well exclusively about the United Kingdom, but many of the points that I'm talking about are probably relevant in other parts of the world. But I think the particular issue about the UK is we have very little land, and there's a big drive from government to actually push new development onto land that has been previously developed, what we call brownfield land. And there's a big push to encourage local authorities to basically provide planning permissions for development on previously used land. And back in 2016, we had this quote from the then Housing Minister, Brandon Lewis: "We want to help hard-working families and first-time buyers to own their own home, and to achieve this by buying on brownfield land wherever possible to help protect our valued countryside." The register helps deliver both of these, and it's the idea of a register of these sites that should be pushed for development. So that's sort of the background to it. And the question is, what issues do we face? Well, obviously, if you're building on previously used land and the potential for there to be contaminants there, people that are going to live on them would really like to see that the risk is removed. But this little quote I've got here from a guy called Walter Wriston: "Life is more risk management rather than the exclusion of risks." And that is the problem we're faced with, because in reality, it's not possible to remove risks, but we have to be able to evaluate them and manage them. And to do this, we're given some tests, and they're very definitive legal tests. This comes from what is grandly entitled Part 2 of the Environmental Protection Act. And in that, it gives us a definition of contaminated land. And for the purpose of the Act, it is any land which appears to the local authority in whose area it is situated to be in such a condition by reasons of substances in, on, or under the land that significant harm is being caused, or there is a significant possibility of such harm being caused. Or the other part of it is actually there is pollution of controlled waters. We've got to consider both. Now, the first test, because it's a bit of a long and horrible mouthful, significant possibility of significant harm, we actually now call SPOSH, which just sort of makes life a little bit easier for us. We contaminated land, people like talking about it, and probably because no one else understands what we're talking about. Now, in the first form of statutory guidance that were produced, we were given a test for POSH, which is the possibility of significant harm, and it's if the amount of the pollutant in the pollutant linkage in question, which a human receptor in that linkage might take in, or to which such a human might otherwise be exposed as a result of the pathway in that linkage, would represent unacceptable intake assessed on the basis of relevant information and toxicological properties of that pollutant. Again, quite a big mouthful, but what we basically have to be able to do is evaluate what contaminants are on the site, in what concentrations, and what amount of that contaminant would be taken in by a person, or even environmental receptors on or around the site, and then to be able to establish whether those intakes would be acceptable or unacceptable. And just to show you a little bit about how complicated it is, I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, but we only started talking about contaminated land about in 1999, when a guy called Hugh Rossi, who worked for the Parliamentary Select Committee, Science Committee, produced a report on land contamination, and he reached three conclusions. And one was, in the United Kingdom, we have a lot of contaminated land, but we don't know how much. The next one was that it could be causing environmental harm, but we don't know how much. And the other one is it could cost an awful lot of money to put right, but we don't know how much. And the government ought to do something about it. And the government was quite prompt in this. And back in 1990, they came up with the Environmental Protection Act, which gave you those tests that I have talked about. But you can look at this chart going across to the right with all the elements on it. And it wasn't really until 2006 that the government gave us the first set of guidance as to how to interpret the Act in 1990, and you couldn't actually implement the Act until the guidance came in. And we've still been redeveloping and redirecting this guidance, which was finally updated in 2012. So for the poor practitioner, there's a lot of things to be thinking about. And the question is, Will it be changing again? Well, there has been more change to the non-statutory guidance, but the 2012 statutory guidance is what we still have to live with, and I'll be talking a little bit about that. So what are the key risks to human health risk assessment? Well, obviously this whole question of SPOSH, and we are now in the 2012 guidance given 4 categories. Category 1, or known as red, is a strong case for determination, in other words, establishing that the site is contaminated. The next one is green, which is basically equivalent to normal background concentrations of contamination, as it would be screened by these things we call generic assessment criteria, or GACs. And then in the middle, we have amber, which is far less straightforward because they're not obvious. And there's amber red, which would be considered contaminated, and amber green, that could be considered uncontaminated. And the decisions, it says, cannot be made only on the basis of calculation. Now, I've tried to produce you sort of this little graph to show the issues we're dealing with. And the green triangle is looking at the increase in risk. And at the bottom of this little chart, you've got where the risk is negligible. And then you've got at the top of the chart where the risk is high. And we have a line that I've put in at the top, is the unacceptable region. Now, that's the region where above that line, you would be considered, the site would be considered contaminated under the definition. It's where the intake, as I've mentioned to you before, would be unacceptable. But that's in terms of the test for land contamination, which would be basically statutorily regulated, and someone would have to do something about it. But if you were trying to redevelop a site, it probably isn't the value you would need to use. You would need to use this lower line, which is a broadly acceptable region, because if someone is going to live or buy property on a land that has had some previous use, they would want to know that it was broadly acceptable rather than it being unacceptable. And just to show you how these fit with the 4 categories, category 1 there would be at the top, the red category. This is the sort of thing that if you walked on, it would probably melt your welly boots. You would feel very uncomfortable being anywhere near it. The green region is probably a nice green looking grassy field where you wouldn't have much worry about it at all. It's never had anything on it before. But as I've said, the problem is with the 2 areas in the middle, amber red and amber green, or 2 and 3 as they're called now, where you've got to distinguish between whether it's below or above this unacceptable region. So what challenges do we face? Well, actually, the whole issue of land contamination isn't just the scientific one of intakes and all that. There's a wide range of other issues we've got to deal with. And unless we can provide confidence in the science, then we're actually going to lose some of the other battles as well. And I've just listed these out, the social one, and what is the public's perception of the problems compared to the reality. Economic, can we actually afford to do something about it? And then the scientific ones, the environmental on-site, can the site be rendered safe for anyone living or occupying it? Off-site, could the site actually be causing risks off-site to other sensitive receptors, whether that be environmental receptors such as rivers or groundwater, or other people living on or around the site. And then there's actually a big issue about engineering, and can the actual site be made sufficiently stable? I'm not actually going to talk much about that, but that can be as much a problem as dealing with the other more environmentally related issues. And then trying to encapsulate all this, we have the regulation, we have planning, we have to actually obtain planning permission, and it gives the local authority the requirement to make sure that the site could never be determined. And the developer have actually got to make sure that the site is safe, and probably 2 different tests, maybe relating to my unacceptable and acceptable lines on the previous slide. And then we've got waste permitting issues, and that would be a day's seminar in itself, so I'm not going to talk about that at all. And what can go wrong? Well, this is actually an example of a school up in Scotland, and you may have seen it in the news over the last few years. But there was great concern that this school that had been built on a previously used site hadn't been done safely. and the staff came out and actually refused to work in the school anymore. Supposedly, the little picture of the glass on or the plastic cup on the right-hand side is the colour of the water that was coming out of the taps in the school. But it became a huge issue as to whether this was safe. Obviously, the residents and the parents of the students were concerned, and this is where it all became. It actually turned out there wasn't a major risk associated with this site, but this is the sort of political pressure that can be developed. And another example, which you may have picked up on, it actually happened a number of years ago, where the former steelworks in Corby was redeveloped. And there was a class action pulled together. And actually, it was around these children here that were born during the time the site was redeveloped. And they all had one form of birth defect or another. And the class action was that these birth defects had been related to the contamination on the site, and that actually being allowed to get out during the remediation process. Now, this became a really big political issue, and you might recognise this picture of a lady in her former guise. It was even before she was Home Secretary, but she was the MP for a particular area where remediation was proposed for a site, and she quoted from the Corby case on her website, actually she referred to it in Parliament as well. And she said, this case puts beyond doubt the link between exposure to toxic waste and birth defects. Unless the council can guarantee the safety of people close to the site, and with the current information available, I do not believe that they can do, then this development should not go ahead. Now, she was totally misreading or maybe purposely misreading the account from the judgment, because the judgment just said that there was a possibility that there might have been a link, and subsequently actually it's been proved that probably there was no link at all. And yet this just shows you the political escalation that can be, and this affected many developments, including the particular one that she was talking about in this case. Anyway, talking about politicians, I thought we would talk about maybe some Americans. And obviously the problem of actually trying to provide confidence that we know what we're talking about, we need to be able to tell people what we need to find out. And Donald Rumsfeld, I think, was very helpful in explaining to us some of these problems. And he said there are known knowns, things that we know are there, and we can actually go and measure them. And then there are things that we know they are the things that we know that we know. Then there are known unknowns. Those are the things that we think are unknown. We think we know about them, but at the moment they're unknown, but we can go in and look for them and maybe measure them. And that is to say that there are things that we know that we don't know about. But the really tricky bit is, what about those things that are unknown unknowns? And that really is the challenge that faces us that have to investigate land contamination issues. And I actually quite like throwing this one in as well. And this is our friend George Bush. And he had this wonderful quote, and he said, "Our enemies are innovative and resourceful, and so are we. They never stop thinking of new ways to destroy our country, and nor do we." And I just do wonder, with the way we regulate land contamination in many countries of the world, whether actually we're not causing ourselves more problems than maybe we're trying to resolve. So that's sort of really by way of background. What I'm going to try and do in the next few slides is explain the sort of issues that we have to look at to try and resolve these questions, and the sort of data that we have to collect to try and find out about a site. And here I'm sort of talking about this area of land here, which is a potential piece of land for development. It's got houses along one side, a school, more houses there, and a river going down here. Bit difficult to see, but there's a little public playground there, and there's actually even more difficult to see. There's a couple of people walking across the site because there's actually public access across this site. So we have to actually find out whether this site presents us a risk or not. So how do we actually go about it? Well, that's the sort of development we're looking to put on it, a new sort of warehouse building and maybe some more houses. So how do we find out what's gone on? And there's a lot of different ways that we actually can research in, what is going on the site, building up what we call a conceptual site model. And the first mechanism is looking at old history, historical information, which could be based on maps or records of what's gone on. And that starts off to give us some background information as to what's going on. We then might go out with a big digger and start digging holes so we actually can look at what's in the ground, and we would take samples. And this is where we started to get this problem of actually working out what the data from these samples mean. If we're digging a hole there, how relevant is that particular piece of data to our understanding of what exposures to future occupiers or current occupiers might be? We might try and look for what's going on deeper into the ground by using drilling rigs, and again getting more samples. And the other thing we've got to remember is that we might be testing groundwater as well, and groundwater doesn't stay still, and some of the contaminants in the ground might not stay still either. They might be moving if they're oily contaminants, or if they're soluble contaminants and can move. So not only have we got the problem of spatially trying to understand what's going on, but also there is a time element to it as well, all of which is adding to the complication of building up a picture of what this site represents. Then we can go in for using geophysics to try and fill in more of the information and find out what's going on there. Looking at geophysics can provide us a lot of data on the subground. We can even fly little drones, and there's more and more of this going on, and actually taking pictures of the surface and using false color photography and various other sensors to actually try and find out more surface characteristics about the site. We then need to do a lot of monitoring. I mentioned groundwater and ground gas can be there, both of which could be moving. We need to monitor it on a regular basis to see what happens seasonally with changes in atmospheric pressure, all sorts of other things that can move it. So these contaminants we have to try and tie down. I've put this one in because actually we have to try measuring the geotechnical strength, and this is just a particularly simple way of doing it, of loading it up with some waste skips. And ultimately, we build up a picture of the site which might look something like this. And this is really what we would call our conceptual model, looking at the different makeup of the different soils, the natural horizons, and the man-made deposits which may be there above them. So in this particular one, I'm showing that we've got colliery spoils, we've got landfill there, we've got mining geology underneath with coal mines and groundwater boreholes, all there, which could cause us issues in terms of establishing risks associated with the site. And I've just highlighted some of the issues there. Now, in terms of exposure, we've got to look at the exposure. And I mentioned these little tiny people. We've got to establish what the exposure is to those people walking across the site, to the children in the playground that might be particularly sensitive, and then also the potential for gases to come out of the site and migrate elsewhere. Might be noxious substances getting out, and then also the movement of gases or water in the ground and getting to other receptors, in the case of the borehole, the groundwater borehole, or the river. And all those issues are then got to be considered again when you put the new development on, because we have all those pathways again which potentially affect our new development. And you've got the particular issue then of working out the contamination that might be in the garden. And that again highlights as an issue. You know, if we have a resident in that particular house, how does the data that you have collected relate to that particular garden rather than the area as a whole? And this can become a very contentious problem, particularly if the contamination isn't uniform, and in most cases it isn't. The other issue that we sometimes have to deal with is whether actually the contaminants in the ground can actually permeate into water supplies and get into the houses that way. Again, another issue that has to be looked at. And then the potential actually for ground gases, whether they be explosive gases or toxic gases, getting in through the substructures into the buildings themselves. And I've just put in the exclamation marks here because there's the whole question of the geotechnical stability of the sites as well. And mine collapse and old mine shafts as well can be very significant hazards. I'm sorry, that slide was going to be talking about the remediation of the site, but I think probably you've had enough of me talking about the lovely details that I enjoy playing with on a day-by-day basis. I just thought I would highlight a few examples of sites. This is a big development up in the northwest, which is grandly entitled Logistics Northwest. It's rapidly being developed with big storage sheds. But it has previously been excavated for coal mining, and you can see here there's actually this area here they've actually dug down to the coal mine, and these are the sort of pictures of what it looked like, and this is what's going on the site now. So you can see that with quite a number of issues that having to be addressed on this site as to what was there. And we have to establish what the potential risks are to each of these individual properties, to the areas of public open space that are left, even to the buildings themselves. And obviously geotechnical problems are fairly major, but the contamination ones and the ground gases have to be considered as well. Another example, which is actually the one that Theresa May was talking about down in the southeast, what looks a relatively innocuous site, but you do wonder because it's a bit scrubby and nasty looking. And then you see a sign on it which says contaminated land, keep out. And when you start digging it up, this is what it looks like. And ultimately, this is what you're trying to put on it. And this actually is the development. It took nearly 20 years to get everyone to agree to the risk assessment and the remediation method for this site. And I mentioned a little bit about some of the public perception to it. And clearly having a strong handle on what the contaminants are in the ground and reliably being able to understand what the concentrations of those contaminants are is a major issue. Another example here, I put this one up because it's one that I remember from my youth. This is Orgreave Colliery, and if anyone goes back as far as the miners' strike, this is where the famous Battle of Orgreave took place. But you can just see from this aerial photograph the intensity of development of this site, the blackness of the ground, a real issue. These are sort of that's a picture on the site showing the part of the gasworks that was on the site as well as the coal mining that took place. This is part of the open cast work that took place before port redevelopment, and this is the redevelopment taking place. And you can see that there's housing going up here, there's a lake up there, and then the big technical park being built at the top of the site. And all the issues of trying to tie down what contaminant levels we're dealing with, what concentrations they are, and what's appropriate for this area of ground, which is still undeveloped. How about underneath this building, and then obviously the very sensitive end use of the housing over here. Another example in the southeast of England, a relatively innocuous looking bit of green field, but when you dig it up, it looks like this and that. And then ultimately being redeveloped with houses. I'm only putting these pictures up because it shows you the sort of things that we're dealing with, but we have to be able to understand what the concentrations are of contaminants so that we can actually come up with remedial solutions like this. So what are the key issues to human health risk assessment? Well, I've mentioned these 4 SPOSH categories and the 4 different values. And this whole point about the risks and where these different levels come in. Now, for the housing development, if we're trying to work out whether the site can be developed, we'd be looking at the lower range, trying to make sure that the site is in this green zone. And we have to be able to do it sufficiently reliably that we can give people confidence that they are in that green zone and not above it. In terms of the local authority determining the site under Part 2A, they've got this higher range, this higher level of unacceptable region. And I put this chart in again because ultimately, as engineers and scientists, we have to be able to decide which side of these lines we are. And as Nigel will probably tell you later on, these lines themselves can move. As our understanding of toxicology changes, as our understanding of migration pathways are basically improved. So not only have we got to work out which side of a line we are, but we aren't even certain that we know precisely where the line is. So really, I was just going to finish on that because that, I think, is the challenge that I was faced when we were looking at the statistics guidance. And I'm not going to go into any of the detail of it because Nigel clearly will tell you a lot more than I would. But ultimately, we have to be able to understand contaminant concentrations. We have to be able to predict what is in the ground so that we can calculate exposures and work out what intakes the receptors would have on the site. And you can have this real challenge of trying to understand whether or not you're above or below a potentially moving target. And it's been fun and games, as Nigel will tell you, over the last 3 or 4 years to try and reach a consensus. But before, we had a simple test, which was in the first guidance that we had, which was basically giving you a nice bright line, and the scientists loved it because if you were above or below, it gave you an answer. But as that was used in a number of different cases, it really became clear that it was not really a reliable tool, and that's when I called in Nigel and said, is there any way we can look at this? And I think the solution he's given us to look more holistically at our data has been extremely helpful. I've got a horrible feeling I've run on for a few minutes too long, so I apologise by that, but I hope you just found a bit of background, some help in understanding what I think Nigel will be talking a bit more about.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Peter. I think we can probably go straight on to the next speaker, unless we have any queries. There's a few comments in the chat, but I think we can bring them out in the general discussion. But thank you very much for that excellent background, Peter. And you've led very nicely into Nigel. So let me just introduce Nigel. If you'd like to put your slides up, Nigel.
Yep.
Nigel is an independent statistician based in Bath, and his career of 30 years splits into 2 parts. He doesn't look old enough for 30 years, but for the first 15 years, he worked in the food industry. And then in 2006, he set up his own statistical consultancy company. And he's provided statistical and training services to over 150 organisations across a wide variety of industries in both the public and private sector in the UK and beyond. Nigel's mission is to explain complex statistical ideas to non-statistical audiences in such a way that they can make use of his results. As Nigel will explain, it was this aspect of his career that he wanted to bring to the table when he was asked to lead the writing of the new statistics guidance for Clare. Nigel's proficiency is amply demonstrated by the clear and comprehensive 38 pages of the guidance report, which I've had a look at and I would definitely recommend reading. Nigel is very active in the Royal Statistical Society, having served as both Chair and Secretary of QIS, the Quality Improvement Section, and he's also been a member of the RSS Professional Affairs Committee. He regularly writes on statistics topics via his publicly available blog. So Nigel will talk about the statistical content of the new guidance and the work he did to satisfy himself that he had truly understood the limitations of the Central Limit Theorem and that his recommendations were statistically robust. So over to you, Nigel, please.
Thank you, Shirley. Can just confirm you can see and hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this talk with the title of Dr Groundlove, which I'm afraid I couldn't resist for this. I think Peter set the scene very well there. And whilst I'm going to be talking about some of the statistical issues, I want to start first of all with the guidance itself. Now, there is a link, if you look back up in the comments box, I put a link up at the start of the meeting to the actual document that Shirley had just mentioned. But in a way, the UK land contamination sector, as it's formerly known here, has inadvertently become the first to move to a world beyond P less than 0.05. And that's a reference to the 2019 editorial written by Wasserstein, our next speaker, which was entitled Move to a World Beyond P less than 0.05. And it was inadvertent because it was in 2016 that the first steering committee sat down to decide what needed to be done. And in March of that year, the ASA had put out their p-value statement Now, like a lot of statisticians, I read it. I thought it was a very good challenge to the world. And, you know, I sort of took it in. But for a lot of us statisticians, this wasn't a new issue. The issue was the wider scientific world, research world. Did they truly understand the limitations of p-value? And as will become clearer, this particular paragraph of the ASA statement in 2016 ultimately became the bedrock of the CLARE guidance. Now, I've broken the paragraph down into 6 bullet points. I wasn't how it was presented in the statement, but I'll come back to that, why that became the bedrock. But the whole process of developing the new guidance was bookended by the 2 publication from the ASA. So first of all, the statement in 2016, which really said what the issues were with p-values and how it could be misused. But then in 2019, it wasn't, must make it very clear, I know Ron being on at me about this, it was not an ASA statement, it was an editorial in the American Statistician on p-values, but saying, well, how should you do things going forward? And these paragraphs here, I will have to say, Ron, a real lot of real nice literature prose wouldn't think that statistician could be so write so well as this. But a couple of points that I picked up here, and this first line, second line, sorry, second paragraph, first line, second paragraph, but where researchers are free to treat p equals 0.51 and 0.4049 as not being categorically different. This is one of the issues that I was briefed on with the previous CLARE guidance, where they were based on classical hypothesis testing. The guidance, if you read the old one, could have been that 101 out of a university degree course on hypothesizing, pure orthodoxy on p-values there. But it had led to this bright line form of thinking. And so I had very much entered the whole process of working on the new guidance with CLARE with a mindset which actually Ron echoed with this last paragraph, particularly the last line where it said researchers would be free to communicate all their findings, their glorious uncertainty, knowing their work would be judged by the quality and effective communication of their science. I know nothing about land contamination. I'm not the expert. Peter is. And that's what they should be judged by. They should be judged by the quality of their science, not by their p-value. And the bit I wanted to bring to them was to this sentence, which I really do like. As statistical significance is used less, statistical thinking will be used more. And that was very much the mindset I wanted the new guidance to reflect, if it could. And so in 2017, before I actually got down to writing the first draft of the guidance, I wrote a little prequel just to get everybody on board on the steering committee as to how I was going to approach this. And in there, I put in these 6 very basic box plots, indicated the indicative of a scenario where we've taken a sample size of 30, so you can imagine 30 of those holes dug up by Peter diggers or boreholes or whatever he's using to take those samples, and a certain contaminant, could be lead, for example, has been measured. And then these are dot plots of what we have. And then the pink zone here represents the unacceptable zone that we're trying to avoid. We want to stay in this white zone here. And it's the mean concentration that's of interest, which is the dark grey bar, and then a confidence interval represented by the light grey bar. I'm not doing any fancy graphics, and there was actually a point for why I didn't want to do fancy graphics. I wanted to illustrate that the thought process should be quite sufficient. And so in these 6 scenarios, I wanted to make the point that there was no real need to do any fancy calculation. That scenario there should be a straight path. You know, all sample data points are in the white zone here. They all appear to be from broadly the same population. Next case, let's move on. So let's move on to scenario B. Well, the mean seemed to be acceptable. By the way, I should make it clear that the mean concentration is the statistic of interest here, because for most contamination, or at least in this guidance reflects to, it's cumulative exposure that mattered. It's not individual exposure that is the risk. The risk comes from cumulative exposure, and therefore the mean concentration statistic of interest. There are some contaminants where you would have to measure it differently. That's outside the scope of the guidance, but it's cumulative exposure that matters here, hence why the mean is so important. So we have a scenario here where the mean again is in the white zone, the confidence interval is in the white zone. But here I'd be saying, well, hang on, stop and think again, because it looked clearly like you've got 3 different populations of contaminants here, low, medium and high. Are you sure your sampling plan would done in the correct way to properly measure those 3 populations? If you didn't, then how do you know that's a fair estimate for mean? You may need to go back and rethink this one. Here, you could probably say, well, that's the past, even though it looked like there's 3 separate populations here. Overall, I don't see a risk there as such. It looked acceptable. We can go ahead. I'd like to understand why we have 3 separate populations, where my science comes in. Scenario D, well, that's a clear fail. There's a problem there. Go ahead and fix it. Scenario E, it's borderline, but it's obvious that these samples up here are possibly the main source of the issue. Do they represent, say, a particular corner of the site that could be dealt with separately, and the others represent the majority of the site that actually, well, yes, it's contaminated, but it's not really heavily contaminated? The point I was making, that those 5 charts there, no calculations were actually needed in order to make any conclusions and judgment. These charts simply supplement your expertise as a land contamination specialist. It's only when you really get into this scenario F that I think true statistical inference had to come in. It looked like a single population. We've got an estimate for mean, but we are pretty close to this borderline, or are we? So this then led to the guidance document recommending the starting point. We really have to do exploratory analysis, and therefore something like a dot plot, a box plot, and summary statistic and spatial plots, because remember, this is the sample taken in space, in 3 dimensions, not just north and south, but also top and bottom that are digging down as well. So it's a 3-dimensional sample, and so how you represent the 3-dimensional sample is an additional chart that's needed. But one thing I didn't want to be was prescriptive. So while the recommendation was, let's just plot your data like this, and start with this and see what it tells you. Well, with a nice situation like this, it's clear we don't need to know anything about p-values or t-test or anything like this. If we're satisfied that the sampling plan is a fair sample, given what we know about the site, and this, of course, is the important conceptual site model that Peter just talked about. As statisticians, we know the first rule with any sample is why are you taking the sample, what's the objective, and what's the target population. But the CSM is the process by which the industry answers those questions. From that, you can design the sample, and if it's fairly done, then we can get the statistic and draw a conclusion. But it's nothing here that needs complicated statistics at all to say this is clear and obvious. So in the guidance, and with a bit of benefit of hindsight, I don't think I quite made that completely clear, that if you were in a clear and obvious situation, you didn't have to worry too much about the stats. It does say it, but it perhaps could have made that a bit more explicitly clear. But consequently, for the purpose of the guidance, we decided to illustrate the statistical thinking in order to draw a conclusion with 3 borderline cases. And so these are the 3 data sets, which are actually based on the real data set. And as will become clearer, I just distinguish between the 3 data sets by something I call data type. We would call them distribution, but I decided that for the population of people who are going to use the guidance, I thought the word data type would probably come across better than the word distribution. But here, is the underlying data symmetrically distributed, or even negatively skewed? I would count that as symmetry. Or is it symmetrical in the log scale, but obviously asymmetrical in the actual scale? Or the third data set that was chosen, is it fat-tailed? Now, I the word factorial picked up from Nahum Talib, who I'll come back to in a minute, but I'm sure there's lots of other words we've used over the time, you know, extreme valued, but this is heavily asymmetrical data where most of the data is very little or very low contamination, and then you get the odd samples with very, very high levels of contamination. So the guidance produced these three scenarios to illustrate the thought process that was needed. Now, this is where, with the benefit of hindsight, I wish I'd actually read the 2016 ASA statement a bit more closely, because although I'd read this paragraph, I hadn't fully linked this with what I was trying to do for Claire. But it was Peter, when he read the ASA statement, he picked up this paragraph. And when I looked again, I thought, this is exactly what I want the guidance to say. That good statistical practice as an essential component of good scientific practice emphasised these 6 bullet points, which are not bullet points in the statement itself. But the first one is principle of good study design and conduct. So this is where the conceptual site models, CSMs, that the industry specialise in come in. Have they actually done this? It doesn't always happen, from what Peter tells me. They're supposed to do it, but it doesn't always happen. Then the sampling plan, has that been selected according to statistical principles? There is guidance on how to select a sample in other industries and other areas, including BSI, British Standards Institute. But sampling plan specific to land contamination is a little bit thin on the ground. And then defining the critical concentration, as Peter said, the boundary between the 4 colours of you know, red, amber, green, amber, red, and red. I think I've listed that correctly. But anyway, how to define those boundaries? Again, that's an industry. So all of that had to be in place. And the important thing about this guidance is that this guidance doesn't cover that bit. That's all assumed to be in place in the first place. And it was that element that took why it took us 3 years. The rest of it was relatively easy to agree, some disagreement, but in general, we got there fairly quickly. What we didn't have agreement on was how much needed to be put in the prerequisites on point 1. Because the idea was that people should know that already before they read it. But the danger was that people who don't know about how to do that would jump in and do the stats without having done the prerequisite. And we went back and forth over that for 3 years, how to address that. But point 2, a variety of numerical and graphical summary to data, hence the dot box spatial plot confidence interval. Understanding of the phenomenon of study, well, that's why you have a CSM. But the point I want to bring in here is, well, OK, if I'm sampling lead here, measuring lead in this sample, how did it typically behave? Would I expect a symmetrical distribution, log symmetrical, or fat-tailed? You know, starting to link your understanding of the contaminant to statistical behaviour. Do the results show that were they what you expected? Do you actually need to go back and start again, revise your CSM? Are you actually sampling in the wrong place here? So before you draw conclusions, you need to actually ask yourself, have you actually got the necessary data to do that? Complete reporting, you know, self-evident. And then proper logical and quantitative understanding of what the data summaries mean. The comparison of confidence interval, critical concentration, especially in the borderline scenario, what's the right way and wrong way to interpret what you see. But more than anything, no single index to substitute for scientific reasoning. And the danger with the older guidance in 2008, that people were, you know, using the p-value in a bright line fashion and failing to look at it more holistically. So you know, when I looked at that paragraph again, I thought, I wish I'd written the first draft in that format. As it was written in a different format. But I then, as we went through the rewrite, I tried to sort of move it back towards that way. But I think this really summarised my whole approach here, that the guidance written on the assumption is going to be read and used by people with a scientific training, capable of exercising scientific judgment, who wish to use that to supplement their professional judgment, not to replace their professional judgment. Not my job to make their decision. It's my job to give them some additional tools so that they make the decision. They're the ones that have to stand up in court and say to you know, the tribunals or planning tribunal to say, yes, it's safe to build there. No, it's not safe to build there. And Claire told me today that there's been over 3,000 downloads of this document since September last year, making it one of their most successful documents so far, at least in download. The proof, of course, is in the pudding of when they actually apply it. So we got to this first draft by the end of 2017, and, you know, we then started getting feedback and everything. And it was then two things happened. First, someone on the committee, who shall remain nameless, Peter will know who he is, said this: the central limit theorem is either true or false. I was trying to explain how the confidence interval is calculated, and the underlying it is the central limit theorem. And I really pulled up short with that statement. I thought, that's not true. It's asymptotic. The central limit theorem says it converges to a normal distribution or the distribution for sample mean converges to a normal distribution as the sample size increases. That's the way I've understood it. So this idea that it's either binary, true or false, pulled me up a bit short. No, that's not right. But then at the same time, Nahum Talib was starting to write his book on the statistical consequences of fat tails. And he was tweeting and blogging about this ahead of writing the book, getting a lot of feedback on what he was writing. And he was doing two things. But first of all, he put out this little exercise, which is actually very relevant to needing to recheck the central limit theorem. So take this little scenario. Two people are selected at random from the UK, and you're told the sum of their height and the sum of their net wealth. You're not told what they are individually. You just know the sum of their height is 13 feet and the sum of their net wealth is 20 million. Then what would your estimate be of the two individuals? Now, straight away, you think, that's slightly unusual, surely, if it's a random sample, to have two people who sum up to 13 feet. But if I were to ask you which of the two scenarios to choose, that scenario A, where one person 2 foot tall and one is 11 foot tall, or both are 6.5 foot tall, I think you would choose the second scenario. But whereas the other one on net wealth, one person is a multimillionaire and the other one has no net wealth versus two multimillionaires, I think you'd be more likely to choose the first scenario. And this is what Talib was trying to do. He was trying to check the central limit theorem, one-way t-testing specifically, and he was testing out all kinds of underlying distributions, sheer variety of them, and particularly testing how quickly the central limit theorem converged to an acceptable point in terms of the distribution of the sample mean as the sample size was going up. And he was coming up with some seriously scary numbers. So that was worrying me. But the point is that whilst we say the central limit theorem is we've got a tendency to say that the central limit theorem is independent of the underlying distribution data. We know that's not true, because the more asymmetric it is, the more the sample size needs to go up before we can achieve convergence. But the worry was we were underestimating the degree that it was converging. And that's why I brought in this concept of the data type, because the question I kept getting asked during the rewrite was, well, how do I know if my sample size is okay? And the guidance wasn't intended to be a sample size document, but it was inescapable. I had to give some sort of indication. Did they have a sufficient sample size? And so I needed to satisfy myself that, well, okay, the distribution of sample mean converges to a normal distribution, sample size increasing, but how fast does it do that, given the types of data that might commonly occur in the land contamination data, and particularly given the sample sizes? Now, this is only something I found out later as I went through the process, that sample sizes of 20 to up to 50 are actually pretty rare. Sample sizes of 20 are much more common. Part of that is developers being unwilling to pay for the sample size, but it's also partly the physical cost of taking the sample. Peter could probably answer more about that in the question afterwards. But large sample size are not that easy. And so with that in mind, I would worry, particularly in a planning scenario where we need to show that the mean concentration is below a certain threshold, basically in the green zone, was there a risk of type 2 errors here, false negative, where we say, okay, yeah, the land is safe, when in reality it's not safe. So, you know, that the task that was specified for the statistical test there, you know, can we confidently say that the mean level of contamination in this land is low relative to some appropriate measures of it? So I'm getting a okay, I want to check. I understand Central Limit Theorem, and of course, I mean, I'm not an academic. I mean, I've done enough maths to read academic text, but I'd much rather learn for myself. So these days, run simulation. Let's just have an underlying log normal distribution here where the standard deviation is 50% the mean. You know, so that's that black line there. Take random samples of size 20, do 5,000 of them, and then count how many times that the confidence interval, two-way confidence interval here, with a notional 95% hit rate, actually capture the true mean as represented by that vertical line there. And the green samples are the ones where it did get a hit, it captured the true mean within the two-way confidence interval, and the red one was when it didn't. So straight away, that's not bad. It's only a sample size of 20, and I've always worked with the rule of thumb 20 to 50 for minimal conversion of the central limit theorem. And I've got a 94% hit rate. But straight away, the one thing that did come up very clearly is that when it's incorrect, it's much more likely the confidence interval is going to be too low. In other words, you'll have a type 2 error. It basically said, oh yeah, things are safe here. In actual fact, the mean is higher. But anyway, that's where the sigma of 0.5 here. Some data set, you know, log normal can have to be much higher, 2.5 here. And then the hit rate dropped off quite dramatically up to under 80%. And this was something Nahum Talib had pointed out when he was playing around with all the different distributions he could conceivably think of. He pointed out the log normal was a very interesting boundary case that in sometimes it's in the family of distribution where convergence is fairly rapid, but in other times it's in a family of distributions where convergence is very slow. And this would be an example where, you know, you really got to increase that sample size before we get any degree or hit rate close to what we're notionally supposed to be achieving. So I'm starting to get a bit worried now. I've written this first draft. I've got the sign on to this more holistic approach. Statistical significance used less, statistical thinking will be used more. But then combination of my own simulation and Nahum Talib scaring the hell out of me with all the convergence rate. I mean, he was getting some distributions where even sample sizes of 1,000 hadn't even yet converged to any acceptable degree. I mean, it was pretty scary. So, you know, and yet there was also true to say that some contaminants do behave in this fat-tailed fashion. They, you know, they get hot spot. The example given to me was plutonium. You know, if you know, plutonium gets scattered around the site, you know, most of the site would become clean and there'd be little nuggets of plutonium. Oh boy, you want to make damn sure you've found the plutonium, don't you? And I just had vision that at some point in the future, this guy gets going to be used. I've written it and somebody say, right, you're to blame for the fact that I didn't find the plutonium here. So I was feeling the weight a little bit at this point. But then I sort of realized, hang on, you know, at statistical significance used less, statistical thinking can be used more. And there are 6 things here which are saving graces that can help me stop worrying about this too much. So the first one came up in the simulation that I point here. I'd already instinctively gone for a two-way confidence interval, which sounded slightly odd, given that the decision usually sort of one way. Is it less than this, or in the planning scenario, or is it greater than this in the Part 2A scenario? But straight away from the very beginning, I felt that the critical concentration was poorly defined, and I wanted to go with a two-way confidence interval to make sure focused effort. Well, do I know what the mean is? Now, I'll come back to critical concentration in a minute, but here's the result of a simulation with sigma of 1, to where the standard deviation of a log normal distribution is equal to the mean. And two things I noted when I tested the one-way versus the two-way confidence interval here was that one was that hit rate didn't appreciably change with the sample size here, though what did change was the balance of the errors being too high versus too low. But it did start to change the hit rate with the one-way. So as you increase the sample size in one-way confidence interval, the hit rate will rise, where it's a little bit more consistent. And actually, overall, the hit rate is just generally better. And it made me realise, actually, what happened with a two-way confidence interval, it had some slack in it. Now, that's the way I like to phrase it. As you increase the asymmetry of the data, the two-way confidence interval had some slack in it that it can take up before it feels the strain of the asymmetry, underlying asymmetry. So I felt, right, I'm on good ground to be using the two-way, and especially when it increasingly became clear that the critical concentration is not actually known. It's not sort of fixed. Two experts can come to different conclusions on that. And I realised that actually one of the things we tend to assume as statisticians when we do hypothesis testing is that our null hypotheses are very well defined, are very clearly defined. We know that we're testing whether the mean of A equals the mean of B, or rather mean of A equals B is the null hypothesis, and we're testing to see if it's different, or that the mean of this equals that, or less than that. And we never stop. Sometimes I don't think we stop to ask, actually, do we know that? And I think actually the more I thought about it, this is a scenario. This is not, you know, testing a sample against a threshold. This is testing a sample against another sample of expert judgment. So straight away, if I've got a scenario like this fat-tailed distribution here, where the confidence interval is extremely wide for a start, but the mean is, you know, 0.5 versus the critical concentration of 1, and it's clear that it's the present or absence of these hotspots up here that determine whether or not the overall mean is too high or acceptable. Are we actually sure about the critical concentration level? I mean, how high does the mean have to be above that level before we start to expose ourselves to significant risk? And that made me wonder, we really need some concept of a dose response curve, because if risk starts going up the moment you get above 1, by the time you get to 1.5, you're in serious problems with risk. That's a quite different scenario from a scenario where, well, even when we get up to 5 or 6, it's still not any appreciable risk at this point. So remember Peter Bosch, the idea of significant possibility of significant harm. I realised with that element of uncertainty about the critical concentration, that was another little saving grace there. Then there's the question, well, how much confidence do we actually have to need? Are we looking at 99% confidence, 95, 80, what? Well, the legal standard for the planning scenario, which scenario I'm most worried about, it's not explicitly written down, but from the way Peter explained it, clearer to beyond reasonable doubt scenario. It's probably putting in a 90% so. But this is why I say, does it actually matter if a theoretical 99% confidence interval is actually a 90% confidence interval once you take into account the strain that the CLT goes under? Then there's another aspect, the calculation for confidence interval is the most basic one here, and it's only, which of course is valid if we're doing simple random sampling of the site. Now, in practice, they tend to do stratified or systematic sampling of a site. I mean, it will be occasions it is simple, but that gives us the opportunity to benefit from spatial correlation. So contamination might rise as you move to the west and fall as you go to the east, or as you go down the soil. Now, if you're familiar with the confidence interval under stratified random sample, between group variation is actually your friend with the potential to reduce your error. But I haven't actually told you how to do that calculation. I've actually given them a calculation confidence interval that is wider than should be used in the case of stratified random sampling. So if I are actually carrying out stratified random sampling, there's a safety margin I've sort of put into it. You know, though I worry that I'm oversimplifying. Again, one of the briefs I was given was to try and encourage more people in the industry to actually use that calculation, because there was a fear that some people just don't even get to this point. One reason why I want to keep the calculations as simple as possible. Now, the last 2 points which I'll go through to finish off is the first one is this idea of statistical thinking would be used more. And this was where I really got my reassurance to central limit theorem more than anything else. And this was to reliant that if you've done your CSM properly and you've got a sense that, OK, the nature of this contaminant is that it probably will be fat-tailed, therefore be a main body of low value and a few extreme values. If I'm a statistical thinker, my sample comes back without any extreme value, I should be asking myself why. I shouldn't be drawing conclusions at that point. I should be asking myself why. And when I actually examined my simulations of the log normal and fat tail distributions that I simulated, it was very clear that the failures of the theory occur when it failed to pick up the extreme value. And in some ways, it changes the sampling to binary sampling between extreme, not extreme, which actually puts you in the field of attribute sampling. But this, to me, was a big potential saving grace. If people were thinking about this clearly, they don't see those extreme values when they should be there. They have to put time to stop and think again before drawing conclusions. And then finally, the final saving grace is that these worried about the CO2 only really apply when the mean is close to critical concentration. You have a borderline scenario. In a lot of cases, it's going to be pretty clear. Now, one final thing I did add in the guidance was this concept of stress testing. If you can't take additional samples to resolve the uncertainty, put in a couple of imaginary extreme values that are plausible and see, does that change your thinking? And if it does, well, that's a clue to what happens. If it doesn't change your thinking, then your decision is clear and obvious. So that takes me to the end of my presentation. And in the end, I now do love the central limit theorem, but boy, was I worried for a while.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nigel. You can see that's another an alternative picture that we were going to use, which is just a brownfield site in the UK, I think.
Yes, it was, yeah.
We do have, we haven't actually got time for a question, but I think I will just ask this one because it relates specifically to what you've said. From, if I could just read it out, it's in the chat. How relaxed have you been in the assessment of what constitutes normal distribution in the first instance? Most brownfield sites are heterogeneous, and strictly speaking, the CSM can identify different ground types as discrete sample populations. But often it's not possible to target each ground type individually because they can be well mixed. Do you think the CSM can reasonably drive the assumption of a normal distribution and, for example, prompt transformation of data assuming a skewed or fat-tailed curve? Can you first of all define CSM, by the way?
Conceptual site model is what Peter was talking about in his talk. So just to remind, the conceptual site model is how you identify your target population and what it is you actually need to know for your sampling plan. Yes, I think this question come up before in the Claire discussion. Maybe I've been a little naive here, but I mean, what I'm challenging industry experts to think about is, well, okay, the last time I looked at a site like this, and the last time when I look at my data set, I can see actually what I ended up with looked pretty symmetrical. It was a site similar to what I'm looking at now, and what I actually got back then was reasonably symmetrical, or it wasn't. Otherwise, you probably have to use your own expertise to say, well, okay, given how they typically tend to behave, I would not be surprised to see symmetry, or I'd not be surprised to see fat-tailed. The one thing that does happen sometimes is that what you think is a single population actually ends up being two quite different populations. And with a client I was working with the other day, where it looks symmetrical overall, but when you split the data by depth, shallow soil versus deep soil, it was clear there are actually two very different populations. Okay. So that's a sort of a broad brush answer to that question.
Okay, thank you. We do have a second question, but I'm going to leave it until after Ron's talk because I want to keep to time. So it's another question about distributions, so we'll come back to that. But now it's my great pleasure to invite Ron. Ron Wasserstein is the Executive Director of the American Statistical Association, the ASA, the world's largest community of statisticians and the oldest continuously operating professional science society in the United States. He's joined us from Washington, DC, and it's midday. So it's a great pleasure to have you with us, Ron. Ron took over the top staff leadership post at ASA in 2007, and he's responsible there for ensuring that the ASA fulfills its mission to promote the practice and profession of statistics. Prior to working for ASA, Ron was a Mathematics and Statistics Department faculty member at Washburn University in Topeka, Kansas, where latterly he served as the university's Vice President for Academic Affairs. Ron is a long-time member of the ASA, having joined the association in 1983, and has been active as a volunteer for more than 20 years. He was the lead author of both the 2016 ASA Statement on Statistical Significance and P-Values and the 2019 American Statistician editorial, Moving to a World Beyond P less than 0.05. And so he's therefore uniquely placed to critique this new guidance with respect to that. So over to you, Ron. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and greetings, everyone. And I trust you're seeing a slide that says Claire on it.
Yep, we are. Thank you.
Great. Well, let me just say by way of personal introduction that very grateful to be invited to participate in this session. There have been two wonderful presentations so far, so I feel like my role here is part to regress this panel session to the mean, and maybe part to, as the only U.S. representative, to make you feel better about the UK. I'm going to be talking about three documents in my presentation. There's, of course, this Claire document that you have seen, and I'll just abbreviate it as Claire. It was mentioned that there is an editorial as part of a special issue of the American Statistician. I'll just call that the TASS editorial. And then Nigel and Peter both mentioned the ASA statement on p-values from 2016, and I'll just call that the ASA statement when I refer to it. And Nigel mentioned this, but I want to be absolutely clear that the 2016 ASA statement is a statement of the association. It was voted on by the board of directors. The 2019 special issue of the American Statistician and the editorial that I co-wrote, those are part of a publication of the ASA, but they don't represent an official statement of the ASA. And I'm speaking in my capacity as an individual researcher today and not as the executive director of the ASA. Because the 2016 ASA statement was so influential in this process, and by the way, this is a good opportunity for me to say how extremely happy I am with this work that's been done with this guidance. It is the very sort of thing that we hoped we would see as we worked through this process to develop the ASA statement and beyond. But it's not a natural thing for the American Statistical Association to wade in on an issue of particular statistical practice, especially one so foundational as p-values and statistical significance. So why did we do this? Well, for one thing, let me just start with a quote. So it's been widely felt, probably for 30 years and more, that significance tests are overemphasized and often misused, and that more emphasis should be put on estimation and prediction. So who said this and when? Well, it's none other than the very estimable Sir David Cox, and he said this in 1986, which means if we take his 30 years literally, that gets us back to 1956, and I will own up that that was the year of my birth. In fact, I just hit my 65th birthday a couple weeks ago, a fact that the U.S. government kept reminding me of by sending me continual reminders about Medicaid. there's a whole history of quotes that can be found at this website, and I'll be glad to make these slides available later so you can have the link. But the point is that this is the discussion that's been going on for a long time, but so we wrote that we didn't really do anything new in the ASA statement, that that this is something that we've been concerned about as a community for a long time. But in the 2010s, things started to really clearly go south. We started to see things in our science press, like odds are it's wrong. Science fails to face the shortcomings of statistics. In this article, statistics is thrown under the bus with issues related to how p-values are used. And in fact, in this article, statistics is referred to as a mutant form of mathematics, which really set me off. And then there was a journal, Basic and Applied Social Psychology, that decided to just ban p-values altogether. And this was lauded in this scientific publication. So for these reasons and others, the ASA decided to move in the direction of putting together a statement on p-values and statistical significance. And again, Nigel highlighted this already, but I wanted to point out that there are 6 principles in that statement, and the relevant principle, the most relevant principle for this presentation is that scientific conclusions and business or policy decisions should not be based only on whether a p-value passes a specific threshold. And the word only is in there, but it was highly debated as to whether only should be included at all. More plainly speaking, we say that bright line thinking is bad for science. And by bright line thinking, I mean what it sounds like, that you have one conclusion on one side of the line and the other conclusion on the other side of the line, and the line, like a Euclidean geometric line, has no thickness. So Ken Rothman, writing in a supplement to the 2016 statement, said this: scientists have embraced and even avidly pursued meaningless differences solely because they are statistically significant, and have ignored important effects because they failed to pass the screen of statistical significance. It is a safe bet that people have suffered or died because scientists and editors, regulators, journalists, and others have used significance tests to interpret results and have consequently failed to identify the most beneficial courses of action. And as you've seen in the previous 2 presentations, we're talking about things that have direct impact on people, and that we just want to be absolutely sure that you can get right. If you remember nothing from Nigel's presentation, it's about how much he suffered in trying to make sure that he could make sure that the best guidance possible was being given. And then, as you heard in both previous presentations, what if the bright lines aren't? That is to say, now I'm not talking about a statistical bright line of p less than 0.05 or greater than that, but even the levels of what makes something contaminated or not are not as fixed as they might seem to be. So in that 2019 special issue of the American Statistician, we argued that it was time to move on, time to say goodbye to the whole concept of statistically significant, of statistical significance, because of a whole series of problems with it that I could spend the entire 2 hours that were allotted to discuss. But in the editorial, Moving to a World Beyond P less than 0.05, and in a Nature article that was released the same day, not coincidentally, Scientists Rise Up Against Statistical Significance, we say that it is indeed time to move on, that there's better, more effective ways to do this science. I'd like to illustrate this with something that I had read in the guidance, and Peter and Nigel had told me about, but it didn't really hit me until I was listening to the presentations today. So I jumped in while others were talking and added some slides to this talk to cover it. In Scientific American, back in 2013, there's a lovely article called Just a Theory, 7 Misused Scientific Words. And for example, one word is hypothesis. Now, these are words that have very specific scientific meanings, and they don't mean the same thing in ordinary conversation. So a hypothesis has a specific scientific meaning that you can see on the screen, but we use it all the time. I have a hypothesis why, my brother is always late to things, or why your mother doesn't like me. Those are guesses. Those are, reasons that we think we know, but we can't really test them. Another one of the misused words was theory, which has a specific definition in science. And there are other words like model and so on, but word number 6 was the word significant. Statistical significance, the word significant has really lost its meaning. The intent of that word was to be something that would suggest, the intent of the concept of statistical significance is to suggest that the results are something that are worth further investigation. But no one thinks of the word significant in that way. And so its use with statistical language is conflated with its use in ordinary language in ways that are really quite troubling. And like I said, if I had more time, I could illustrate that. But this is the thing that smacked me right in the face when the other gentlemen were talking today, and that is this, here's 2 examples. Significant possibility of significant harm. Neither one of these terms, neither one of these uses of the word significant is related at all to statistically significant, but it isn't very hard to see how those things could be connected. So when we're talking about moving to a world beyond p less than 0.05, we talked about in the TAS editorial why it's important to get away from bright line rules, because they can, as Ken Rotham's quote showed earlier, can lead to erroneous beliefs and poor decision making. They give you a sense of confidence that you don't really have, which I'll say more about in a moment. We argue that a label of statistical significance adds absolutely nothing to the information that's already in the p-value, and in fact, by dichotomizing or trichotomizing or whatever p-values, we only worsen the situation. So for example, no p-value can reveal the plausibility, presence, truth, or importance of an association or effect. The p-value isn't going to tell you whether the soil is contaminated, whether the groundwater is contaminated. It can't do that. It's not a tool that's fit for that purpose. So putting a label of statistical significance doesn't mean or imply in any way that an association effect is highly probable, real, true, important, any one of a number of synonyms. And the same thing is true on the other side of the magic 0.05 threshold. A label of non-significance, it doesn't mean that something is unimportant, that it's false. And yet, when we split the world into significant and not significant, it's taken as an imprimatur of authority on these characteristics. It's as though we know something more than we really do. So what we're trying to think about is what this world beyond p less than 0.05 would look like. And this was already quoted, this part of the TAS editorial was already quoted by Nigel earlier, so I won't linger on it. But I put it up here again because this is really the heart of what we're trying to get at. It's really where our passion comes, is that too many things have gone wrong because we have imagined something that we somehow know intuitively can't be right, that somehow there is something different going on in nature, if I get a P of 0.049 than if I get a P of 0.051. That can't be right. We know it's not right. We know these numbers are estimates anyway, so they're subject to variation, and yet we treat the world as though that's the case. And you can't, some of you who are academics and so on know the difficulties of getting your paper published if you don't have a significant p-value. Andrew Gelman put this very well in a blog that he regularly writes. He says statistics is often sold as a sort of alchemy that transmutes randomness into certainty, kind of an uncertainty laundering, as he called it, that begins with data and concludes with success as measured by statistical significance. It's the idea that statistics can take all this uncertainty, which is built into the problem, built into what you're working with, and remove it. Now, statistics is very helpful in understanding uncertainty, in reducing uncertainty, but it isn't going to eliminate uncertainty, and particularly not in as complex a problem as we're talking about today. And so I added that remark that Peter made onto this slide, that we're thinking about risk management, not exclusion. We're not getting rid of risk, and we're not getting rid of uncertainty. Okay. So with that background, I will take just a short amount of time to make some quick thoughts about the CLARE guidance. I love that there's an emphasis right at the beginning about how the practitioner should acquire a full understanding of the potential issues and limitations of their data, along with available methods for assessing it. It's extremely important to understand the limits of a study, and I think it's dangerous to go forward with a study without having given some thought about what those limits are. It's important to make sure that you not only understand them, but that you communicate them, and better still is to be so transparent in what you publish that the results are reproducible. That is, that when I see them, I could go through and conduct the same analysis and get the same result. And also, by the way, that maybe I could conduct an alternate analysis that would be useful or illuminating. Another thing that I will say a bit more about in a moment, but there's this lovely list at the very beginning of things that that study users, that readers of this guidance should do to satisfy themselves that their work is solid, essentially. And this fits precisely with what we have called for in that task editorial, that you put a priority on the quality of your data production by putting a lot of energy into the planning, design, and execution of the study, more energy into that than the choice of the statistical method, which is still important, but is really quite irrelevant if you haven't done careful planning, design, and execution. The CLARE guidance also mentions confidence intervals and suggests that use 2 different confidence levels to help you understand what your data is saying. And I think that's wonderful advice. I would like to emphasize that it's important not to treat those hypothesis tests, not to treat those confidence intervals like they're hypothesis tests and get all caught up in whether the interval contains or does not contain the some threshold that tells you what whether the contamination level is too high or is appropriate or whatever. One-way tests, Nigel talked about one-way tests, and one-way tests I think are especially tempting for this, but they also lose another important thing that Nigel did mention, which is that you need to consider the implications of both endpoints. What is your confidence interval telling you? And it isn't just telling you whether it contains a specified number or not. It's important not to treat those endpoints as hard lines, as fixed cutoffs, so that again, something that's just outside the confidence interval is somehow materially different than something that's inside the confidence interval. And it's even before you get here, do what Nigel illustrated and be sure that you look at your data visualizations first. Look at those very simple graphs. They can tell you a lot of things that might be hidden from you by rushing right into estimates like the confidence interval and other inferential statistics. So I mentioned earlier something that I especially love in the guidance, and it isn't because it's based on this paragraph from the March 2016 ASA statement, although thank you very much for that, Nigel and Peter. What I really like about this is that it really is the epitome of what we hope to see when we said, as Nigel quoted, that we move away from statistical significance and move toward statistical thinking. And this document illustrates that. One of the authors of the special issue, one of the articles in the special issue of the American Statistician, McShane and colleagues, encouraged researchers not to focus on the statistical measure alone, not to get all wrapped up in the p-value, for example, but to think about what else you already know beforehand. What do you know about ground that's like this? What's plausible mechanism explains why your outcomes are the way they are, especially for the work that these folks are doing. Study design and data quality are extremely important. Peter illustrated that, I thought, extremely clearly. And one more thing, as you're thinking about moving to a world beyond p less than 0.05, and it might have crossed your mind that, well, how am I supposed to make a decision in this world? Because I've depended on statistical significance. P is less than 0.05, I get one thing, and it's not, I get something else. But while decisions are generally concrete or discrete, I should say, often binary, it's either you do something or you don't do something. Evidence is not like that. Evidence is generally continuous, and there are multiple streams of evidence to be weighed, not just the statistical index that is a p-value. And I'll just throw this out, Nigel. I can already feel you rushing to take some Tylenol as soon as I put up this next slide. But I wonder if down the line there's a Bayesian approach of some kind to this, because you over time there's certainly a lot of information about distribution of levels of contamination in certain situations, things at least you know to look for that are frequently present in these kinds of properties or whatever. And so is there a way to think about that from a Bayesian standpoint and express that as a prior probability and use Bayesian methods to update that probability based on your data collection? I have no idea whether that's possible or not, but I just thought I'd throw that out there. So that's it, and I'll figure out how to stop sharing, and we'll be ready to roll. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Ron. That's brilliant. Thank you very much for the very clear discussion. So we've now got a bit of time for questions. First of all, are there any specific questions on what Ron was saying? Or shall we go straight to questions that might apply to all the speakers? Just checking if there's any hands raised. Is that you, Nigel, raising a hand?
Yes.
Okay. But before we go to Nigel, actually, can we just deal with a question we had in the chat that was just going back to what Nigel was talking about, although it may be relevant to what Ron was just talking about, the Bayesian approach. It's just a question. Did you consider using skew and kurtosis and then using the empirical rule of data with the average and standard deviation to determine boundaries for measurements? And I mean, that just leads into the whole discussion as how you go about getting these intervals.
Shall I answer that first?
Yes, please. First of all, you, Nigel, on that one, please.
I'm going to answer that one, and I'll also answer Ron's query about Bayesian approach, because it's a sort of connected theme. Peter could probably come in on this as well. So short answer to Jonathan's question is that no, I didn't think of using skew and kurtosis. And though I'm aware that obviously those are metrics, I mean, you're taking me right back to my first career in the early 90s when I did use to analyze skew and kurtosis, price movement and financial markets a lot. But the answer is I didn't. Part of the reason for that is I was conscious of something that Peter said at the beginning of the whole process, where that there was a problem with some people just not using stats at all. And my experience of working with non-statisticians, even scientists, that they can get very a little scared of stats at times. It can look a bit too complex. And so I was trying to keep things as simple as possible. I didn't really want to get into skewness and kurtosis at this point. I wanted to get people using stats which was sufficiently robust. And if we then get into a situation where the industry is actually engaged with that much more, confidently, we can then take them on to the next step. So such as skew and kurtosis, such as something I definitely consider using resampling or bootstrapping method to calculate confidence interval, or ultimately, I certainly had this in mind, Ron, as a Bayesian approach. But my concern, and perhaps Peter should comment on this point, that the industry stats, knowledge and confidence just wasn't there yet. And if they could get these very basic things right, we could then revisit in the future and start adding to it. And, is that fair, Peter?
Yes, it probably is. I think the biggest single difference this statistical guidance has made is, you see, most of the people dealing with land contamination are engineers and scientists of some extent, and they have to make decisions. And they think that statistics, as Ron has very nicely told us we can't, should be able to give us those answers. And that is how it's been applied in the past. And I think, Nigel, when we first got involved, I was involved in a project where someone was actually using this approach to make a decision that was inappropriate. It was basically a fat-tailed distribution. And he was just using it as that and saying that the extreme value could influence the mean of the population, without actually looking at that extreme value and saying, well, actually, is it a part of this population, or should we be looking at it separately? And it was interesting because it went to a public inquiry, and the judge saw this point, and he said that what should have been done is they should have gone along and taken more samples around that extreme sample, that extreme result, to see if it was part of the normal population or whether it was a result of another population. And if this new guidance just gets us engineers thinking a little bit more like that, than just we can bung all the numbers into a model and get the answer out, I think it has done a fantastic job.
Thank you. We do have another question, unless Ron wants to add to that. We could go on to the next questioner.
No, I'm good.
Okay. Thank you. Christian Hennig, would you like to unmute and ask your question, please?
Yes. Hello.
Hello, we can hear you. Yeah.
University of Bologna, formerly at UCL. This is actually very closely connected to the very last exchange between Peter and Nigel, because I was basically wondering, I mean, I have a background in robust statistics, and in robust statistics, one of the things that you learn is that exactly what you were talking about, that the mean is very sensitive against extreme observations and outliers. And the question that I was asking when I saw your presentation is, for distributions like this, is the mean actually the appropriate way to aggregate the values? Because, I mean, obviously then you are extremely dependent on whether you actually observe contamination or not, and that has a strong influence because it may be in very different places. And of course, there's some subject matter knowledge that is important there, which I don't have, but Peter maybe has. So what it exactly means. So because outliers can be observations that are erroneous, or it can be observations that are not very informative, or on the other hand, it can be the important spots where the contamination is, and therefore essential and very important. And therefore, I basically wonder whether computing means there is the right thing, or whether the outliers should be dealt in different ways.
Thank you. Who would like to come in on that?
Maybe Peter should come in first to the relevance of the mean. Do you see it?
Well, the difficulty, the reason we need a mean is that when we're looking at the human intake, which is usually what we're trying to model, we need a number to put into that to work out what the toxicological implication will be. And that's, if you go back to my very first slide, this whole concept of an unacceptable intake, and you have to have a number to put into a number for, I suppose, the concentration of a particular contaminant to put into that calculation. So that's why we need a mean, because that is what someone is exposed to. But the issue is, what actually is the number that we've got to put in? And coming back to my previous example, what was being argued was that this outlier was a normal part of the population, and therefore we should incorporate it in calculating our mean, because there is an equal likelihood of someone being exposed to that as to the rest of it, or there's a likelihood of them being exposed to that. Whereas what the evaluation of the data should have done is actually said, well, this does seem a very odd result. Let's go back onto that site with our diggers and our drilling rigs and everything else and check out what's actually happening there. And actually, you can even go one stage further. You can go further back than that and look at what your historical data is showing you. And in fact, the historical data showed you that there was an old tar tank there, or very close to there. So the likelihood is that this was a separate population that was associated with the tar tank, rather than an outlier or a high concentration in the overall heterogeneous made ground.
Thank you.
Can I just add to that? Yeah. Yes, so, I mean, for me as a statistician here, my understanding when Peter explained that to me, that ultimately what they want to know in the industry is the total. They don't actually want to know the mean. They want to know the total exposure.
Sure, that's right. Yeah. And
so consequently, the correct statistic for estimating the total is number of exposure times expected value, and the appropriate expected value therefore is the mean. But I completely agree. Another scenario, other statistic would be more relevant.
Okay, we have three more questions. First of all, Ron, is it possible to unshare your screen so that I can see the faces bigger? I know that some of the questions follow on from others, but I'm going to take them in a chronological order, if that's okay. First of all, Jonathan, do you want to unmute and have your say? And then Martin, and then Liz.
What I like the idea of using Bayesian statistics, because you can use other work from other sites and then take the data that you've got and obviously model what's the probability that various things are going to happen. That's my first point. And my second point is I think you run a risk that somebody who does know about statistics could present the data in a different way to the standard, and that could actually be more an accurate representation of what's actually in the ground. So I don't know whether that's covered or not.
I think my attitude is I think Bayesian approach absolutely has a place here, particularly the information coming from the conceptual site model. The conceptual site model to me sounds like a prior distribution, particularly if you've got historical data. So I'm completely with you that the Bayesian approach is where we'll probably end up at some point, but I'm not sure the industry is ready for it.
I accept you have to start somewhere with what you're doing, but I think the next steps, there are a number of natural steps that follow on behind it, and it's linked to the other comment about that Liz has made. So she should ask her question, because I kind of sort of agree with her as well.
Okay, thank you. Let's go on to Martin first, and don't forget to mute it, because we had a bit of an echo just now, so I'll mute myself. But Martin, don't mute yourself.
No, I've just unmuted, and then I'll. So Nigel, I just wondered, because I've worked a lot with engineers and other disciplines, they're sort of unused to confidence intervals. But the natural progression I have in many conversations is to use tolerance intervals as well as statistical tolerance intervals to say this is potentially a future value that could occur. Have you thought about mentioning that to some of your scientists, just to make them think about the broader levels of variation that might exist within the data, the soil science that you're looking at?
Could you clarify what you mean by tolerant? Is that like specification?
No, statistical tolerance intervals, either parametric or distribution free. So you can have one-sided and two-sided, and always go two-sided, just as you were doing with the confidence intervals. But if confidence interval for the mean, 95%, whatever. But then, if you wanted to make a prediction about a future individual value from the sample that you've taken your data from, then you get a very wide expanse depending on the sample size you might have taken, and also the nature of the variation within the sample size you've got. So just to educate users that yes, you've got the confidence interval for the mean, this is the potential average value, but in reality is the actual population out there in the soil of whatever it is you're measuring could be much, much greater.
Yeah. Sort of the way of illustrating that by saying, well, what would the value of your next sample be?
Yeah.
Not an approach I've considered. So I don't know whether Peter's probably got a better idea whether that concept rings a bell with the engineers in his field, or whether it's something foreign. I think you're muted at the moment, Peter.
I think you're going a bit beyond my my technical levels here. The only thing I was going to say is if you look in the guidance, one thing we did try to put in there was an indication of the sort of ground types or contamination types that could result in the different types of distribution. And that the whole idea of that was to try and help people when they're looking at their distributions to see whether that distribution is the right one for the particular material they're talking about. And just an example is that if you're talking about a well-mixed made ground, something which has been placed and mixed up a lot, then you could well have a fat-tailed distribution with what could be outliers, but actually they are a realistic part of the population. But you could put it the other way around, and just going back to the example I had, where you've got a relatively heterogeneous soil, but there are historic reasons why there are hot spots in there, and you can actually identify different material types. Then you would go along and say that's not a fat tail distribution. We're actually dealing with materials that need to be considered as a separate population, and that was really the reason for each of the distributions trying to come up with a sort of description of the ground conditions that could result in that distribution type.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Liz and then one from Matthew Rouge. So first of all, Liz, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question.
Hi, yeah, I'm not sure it's a question as much as an observation, really. I have to say, I really like the new guidance. I prefer it from the US 95 approach. But one of the things we've just taken on from what Peter said about you might miss a potential area of contamination, actually we see a lot of the opposite happening as well, is that people are scared of statistics and it's massively misunderstood, and general sample ranges that you get within a data set are misunderstood. And we see regulators struggling in this a lot, where they are seeing problems where there probably are no problems, simply because they don't understand the way that dataset and ranges work. And I think this is going to happen with this guidance just as much as it did with the other guidance.
Okay, thank you.
I would just butt in there and to say, but actually this guidance does make sure you ask the question. It might not give you the answers, but it certainly makes sure that you do interrogate your data and try and work out.
Oh, I don't disagree, Peter. I like this guidance much more than the guidance completely. But the same, I can foresee the same conversations happening, and very recently just had one with really quite low concentrations. Everything sat, quite confidently below that critical concentration with your confidence limits, and still, because there was a single data set that didn't sit below, single data point, we ended up having a very prolonged conversation. There is a complete fear of statistics if it's not well understood, and even I wouldn't call myself a statistician at all, but even being able to explain it does not necessarily mean that the person listening is going to understand.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much, Liz. Matthew, would you like to make your comment?
I think Peter addressed it. It was just to do with, excuse me, the fact that you may not have a second population. Your outlier may be part of your data set, and there's no evidence to suggest it would come from a second population like the coal tar tank, etc. In such circumstances, you should then include it as part of your data set. And I think Peter confirmed that should be the case. Something else I'm aware of, particularly on smaller sites, is that commonly there isn't sufficient data sets to define what the underlying distribution is. Largely that's driven for commercial reasons. When you put in a competitive tender, your client is very unlikely to pay for 20 samples to be tested. And it's only common on the largest sites do we typically get a robust data set from which you can define a distribution. So in a lot of cases, you don't know what the underlying distribution is because there's insufficient data sets, which is driven by commercial reasons.
Okay, thank you. That's a good comment. Can we have one last comment from Christian, which is also related to outliers, and then we'd better wrap up. So, Christian, would you make your comment, please?
I'm a bit surprised by this because I kind of thought there are more questions and therefore I write this, but I can read this out, which is, I understand that it makes sense to include the outliers in the mean total in the circumstances Peter explained. However, there's a concern if sample sizes are small, it means that the proportion of outliers cannot be reliably estimated, meaning that the mean or total estimation will be very uncertain due to the fact that either there could be actually more outliers missing that are in fact on the plot, or on the other hand, an outlier could be in the sample as, let's say, one observation in 20, if on the plot such outlying values are maybe only have a proportion of 1 in 100, and then the mean may be quite strongly off. And I mean that's just a concern. Obviously, I have no idea how to solve that or whether it even can be solved.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think it's worth coming back to Liz's point on that, and it largely comes down to one of economics. I mean, because in that circumstance, you really should be going back to your client and saying we need more data, and it's expensive to obtain it.
Yeah,
I think that is the conflict we face.
Yeah, well,
Okay.
I can jump in just to finish off on that point. I did address this point in one of the appendices where I said, well, okay, what the minimum sample size you need to be pretty sure you're going to get one of those outliers if it exists. So I applied some of the rules of attribute sampling to give that. And some of those numbers are scarily high, but they're there if you want to go to your client, say, right, we need 245 samples here.
But let me say one thing. I think having a sample size that is large enough to get one outlier is not enough, because that still means that the proportion of outliers is hugely uncertain, and the mean also depends on that. Not only, it's not enough to have one in the sample.
Quite right.
Okay, can we have any closing comment from Ron, please, just to wind the session up, since he's our celebrity guest from overseas?
Oh, that's a scary thought. So I want to say again that there's an enormous shift, a sea change between the 2008, I guess it was, guidance and this in not only taking away the concept of hypothesis testing, but really emphasizing the importance of getting the data right, doing the best that you can to design your study, because otherwise all the statistical analysis in the world is not going to save you. So this is a wonderful document, and I'm happy to have had the opportunity to participate in this discussion.
Thank you, Ron, and I'd like to second that as well. I think if we had more documents like this, then we're on a good step forward, that people could actually start thinking about their data and their statistics properly. Okay, I think we're getting some nice thanks in the chat, and I'd like to thank all three speakers for excellent talks, and it's been really interesting, and for the attendees for their contributions as well. So I'll close the session. It's exactly on 6 o'clock, and look forward to seeing you another time. Okay.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Shirley.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Goodbye, all.
Bye.
Bye.